Kitabul Buyu'. And so Imam Maulana al-Imam al-Nasafi, like some other authors, says Kitabul Buyu', the book of sales. Some refer to it simply as Kitabul Bay', right? Looking at the category. So if you look at the category, it's Kitabul Bay', the book of sale, right? And there are different types of particulars of sales and so on. So there's a discussion related to language, which is that the term bay' is a masdar, right? Ba'a yabi'u bay'an, and the basis is that you don't mention it in the plural, right? The basis is that you don't mention it in the plural. But you can mention the masdar in the plural due to some consideration of doing so. So here, Kitabul Buyu' is insofar as there are different types of what is sold, right? And the commentaries give you a breakdown of why it's mentioned in the plural, right? Buyu' is of the mu'amalat, right? Al-mu'amalat, and of the worldly transactions. Right? The ibadat, the acts of devotion, are defined as those acts whose primary purpose is drawing closer to Allah. That is what the direct reason for them is. Right? To draw closer to Allah and the attainment of reward. That's how the ulama define it. The mu'amalat, the transactions, or worldly transactions, are the direct basis of them is fulfilling human needs and interests. And qada masalih al-ibad, fulfilling human interest. But as we know, the mu'amalat, the worldly transactions, become ibadat, become acts of devotion through intention, through their niyyah, and through multiplying one's niyyahs in them. So one does them for the sake of Allah and pursuing them in accordance with the sunnah, in accordance with the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In transactions in general, and Sheikh Hassan al-Hindi in his lessons on the ikhtiyar has a beautiful discussion on this, that in transactions you are at one of three levels that are acceptable. If you can either fulfill the right of the other party, right? The basis is you fulfill the haqq. You sell something, you give it, right? You committed to a deferred price, you fulfill what is due upon you. That's the haqq. And that's fard transactions. And there is above the ada'ul haqq, we see in the Quran, in the Sunnah, the notion of al-ma'ruf is to do so in a good manner, with elements of goodness. Right? So to be easygoing in the transaction, there's elements of goodness. You put a thank you note, whatever, elements of goodness which are known in transaction. The Sunnah points out many of these. And they're known through the Sunnah and through custom. So there's al-haqq, then there's the ma'ruf, to have elements of goodness. And then there is a higher standard, which is excellence, al-ihsan. Just do them with where the elements of goodness reach a degree of completion. That's called ihsan. There's a big difference between doing something in a good way and to do it with excellence. And excellence is rare. These are the three levels of acceptability. If you do not fulfill the haqq, then you are dhalim. You are a wrongdoer. And dhulm in mu'amalat is ashad min al-dhulm fil ibadat. And wrongdoing in transactions is worse than wrongdoing in ibadat. Okay, that's one of the foundational concepts here, right? Now, transactions, of course, have a wisdom. The ulama mention that transactions have an existential wisdom, right? Which they define as baqa'u nizam al-alam. It is the preservation of order in the world. Because baqa'u nizam al-alam. Because preservation of order in creation. Because the how do we understand that the human being is created needy, right? That need, right? They can try to fulfill it on their own, and that's difficult. To fulfill all your needs on your own is difficult, which is why humans have been created in pairs, and in families, and in communities, and in societies, because through ta'awun and tabadul, through assisting one another and through mutual exchange, they are better able to fulfill their non-material and material needs. Right? They say one of the ironies, even non-material needs, human beings have sexual needs, right? And it's generally fulfilling of sexual needs generally is more facilitated through marriage, because they've already two parties have agreed to something, than it is outside of marriage. And there's statistics, right? In general, in some individuals may be unusually able to be promiscuous, and then there's bad situations, etc. But there's harm arising from that as well, right? Similarly, so the fact that human beings are created needy, their non-material and material needs are better fulfilled through coming together, right? As individuals, as families, as communities, as societies. Through non-contractual assistance, ta'awun, right? But also through contractual exchange, ta'aqud. Now, in order for them to come together, there are certain fundamentals that are required, which is that they need to be able to trust one another. Amana. Amana. Because if you can't trust them, then you wouldn't stay together. Right? If husband and wife go to sleep on the same bed, and the wife, when she needs to swat the fly, smashes the husband on the head with the fly swatter, will the husband continue to sleep on the same bed? No, because he can't trust his wife. Then she's going to bash my head in with the fly swatter, right? So he'll go and sleep somewhere else, right? So when dhulm happens in relationships, non-fulfillment of rights, transgressing on the rights of the other, or non-fulfillment of rights, this breaks trust, which relates to dhulm, to wrongdoing, or it causes ruptures in human relationships. And then what happens? Instead of there being cooperation, ta'awun, and instead of there being ta'aqud, contractual dealings, they will instead be dhulm and fasad, wrongdoing. People will wrongfully usurp the wealth and property, even the lives of others. Right? So that's just a little bit of background about that, and the ulama talk extensively about that, but just to understand from the conceptual level, that's some of the hikmah of the tashri'ah. But the laws we take from what Allah and His Messenger tell us, and what is soundly interpreted from them, as we know. So he begins straight away. What is sales? He said, هو مبادلة المال بالمال بالتراضي. It, meaning the sales contract, هو البيع. Right? It, meaning a sale or a sales contract, عقد البيع, is مبادلة المال بالمال. It's the exchange of something of value, something valuable, for something else valuable, with mutual agreement, بالتراضي, with agreement from both parties. So here, in the Arabic language, bay', right, a sale is used for any kind of exchange. And so, similarly, a purchase, shira, is also used, and there are many examples, also for any exchange between two parties, material or non-material. So in the Quran, for example, with respect to purchase, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, إِنَّ اللَّهَ اشْتَرَى مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَنفُسَهُمْ وَأَمْوَالَهُمْ بِأَنَّ لَهُمُ الْجَنَّةِ. That indeed Allah has purchased from the believers their very lives and their wealth in exchange for paradise. Right? And when people get to paradise, they're told, فَاسْتَبْشِرُوا بِبَيْعِكُمْ. Right? So have glad tidings for your sale that you engaged in this life. Right? And the misguided, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ اشْتَرَوُا الضَّلَالَةَ بِالْهُدَى. Those are the ones that purchased misguidance in exchange for guidance, etc. Many verses. Right? So sale and purchase in the language can be used for the material and the non-material. But the non-material we have nothing to do with when we're talking about outward transactions. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said in the hadith, كل الناس يغدو فبائع نفسه فمعتقها أو موبقها. Each day, everyone goes forth. Right? Every morning, everyone goes forth. Even if you sleep in, whenever you do get going, you get going. So, فَبَائِعُ نَفْسَهُ. You are selling yourself. Right? Because you, right, which is your time and your potential, is your capital. You're selling yourself. Right? بَائِعُ نَفْسَهُ. You're transacting in yourself. It's an amazing hadith. فَبَائِعُ نَفْسَهُ فَمُعْتِقُهَا. And you can either emancipate yourself, i.e. from what? From hell. You need enough capital to get out of hell. أَوْ مُوبِقُهَا. Or throwing yourself into perdition. And there's degrees of profit and there's degrees of loss. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about life as a sale and a purchase. There's a capital, which is your time. And there's a reality of loss. Right? What loss? A loss every one of us should be worried about. Right? وَالْعَصْرِ. By time. إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ. The human is indeed لَفِي خُسْرٍ, is indeed truly immersed and enveloped drowned in loss. The one who rejects faith is an utter loss. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, except those who believe. This is loss aversion. وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, and do righteous deeds. You've warded off absolute loss. But there's relative loss. Have you perfected your faith? No. There's relative loss. Are you constantly in devotion to God as though you behold Him? No. There's relative degrees of loss. Do you do all righteous deeds? No. Relative loss. Even if you did all righteous deeds, do you fall short qualitatively in your faith, in your righteous deeds? There's relative loss. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ. That's just personal loss prevention in terms of personal responsibility. What about وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ, and who counsel one another to truth, who call one another to truth, which is what the messenger has come with, guidance, and calling others to all worldly good, nasiha. وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ, and who counsel one another, meaning support, assist, and facilitate one another, بالصبر, to remain steadfast on that. Who is there who really does that? Few. Right? Few. So that's something to keep in mind. That while we transact materially, our life is a transaction. And there's ribh, right? And there's khusran, right? Right? There's profit and there's loss. That's why Imam Abdul Ghani Nabulsi, rahimahullah, says there's a wisdom why tawfiq, right? Tawfiq, complete divine facilitation, is only mentioned once in the Quran. وَمَا تَوْفِيقِي إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ, and my success is only by Allah. It's only mentioned once. You only have success by Allah, it's only mentioned once. It is so rare. Anyways, that's something to think about. So, هو مبادلة المال بالمال. We're going to stick to the outward, but just keep in mind that all this exchange relates spiritually to your life transaction with God, right? But we won't get into that beyond this. So it's an exchange of something of value for something else of value with mutual agreement. وَيَلْزَمْ بِإِيجَابٍ وَقَبُولٍ, and it becomes binding with offer and acceptance. وَبِتَعَاطٍ, and with nonverbal exchange. Okay, so let's see. Right? Sales is an exchange. It's mubadala. Right? Mubadala. This presupposes that there be two transacting parties. Right? Imam al-Mawsili defines the integral of the sale. This transaction is suduru ruknihi min ahlihi ala mahallihi. It's for its integral. Like how does a sale happen? If it's integral, valid offer and acceptance takes place with those fit to transact, which is two transacting parties. Age of discernment, sanity. Right? So you can't buy and sell the property of someone insane or of impaired mental capacity. Someone's hospitalized due to a major stroke, they have loss of cognition, and you go and buy their car for them for $25. Right? You can't. It's not valid. But this also, of course, entails that there be mubadala, that one party, you cannot buy and sell to yourself. Right? You cannot buy and sell to yourself. How could that happen? Let's say Dar al-Munir has published this wonderful edition of the abridgment of Ihya Ulumuddin. So I got 10 copies to sell for $50 each. So what do? I said, hey, I'll buy a copy myself. Can I buy a copy from myself for myself? The basis is no. I need to make that, either get permission from the person I'm an agent for, right? So then it's taking place. But why? Because otherwise, I'll give myself a special discount and so on. And a lot of times people are not careful about that. Of course, after the fact, when they give permission, they don't object, you charge market price, it's okay. But basically, if you take something to sell on behalf of another, then, we'll look at agency, but that's one of the problems that arises from this. Anyways, so exchange of something of recognized value for something else of recognized value. Number two, that mubadalat al-mal, something of value. Al-mal is an item of value. What is mal? What is an item of value? It's that which people put a price on. That which people would pay for. Whether permissible or not. Doesn't have to be all people. Some people would pay for it, right? If you go to some of our attitudinally divergent brethren and say, I'll sell you a sibha, you could have a conference hall of our attitudinally divergent brethren. Nobody would want to pay $1 for it. Maybe, right? But it's an item of value, right? Why? Because some people would pay for it, right? But then the condition for Muslims buying and selling something, it has to be an item of value, it has to be mal, and has to be mutaqawwim, right? So an item of recognized value. This is called al-mal al-mutaqawwim. Mal is anything people would put a price to. Some people or all people. Right? It is considered mutaqawwim, right? Mutaqawwim, of recognized value, if they say al-mutaqawwim ma ubiha al-intifa'u min bihi shar'an, is that which is permitted to benefit from in the Sharia. That which is permitted to benefit from in the Sharia. So, for example, and I don't want any of the Trontonians to answer this, please. Is wine an item of value? Is khamr mal? Anyone? Yes. So then, can a Muslim buy or sell wine?
No.
Why?
Is it because it goes against the Sharia? Because we're not allowed to consume it.
Yeah. Yeah. So wine is considered mal, right? Because people pay for it, right? But for Muslims to transact, it has to be mal, it has to be something of value, right? Which something, a price would be ascribed to, but has to be mutaqawwim, recognized value. Recognized value meaning ma ubiha al-intifa' minhu shar'an, that which is permitted in the Sharia to benefit from. Okay? But this has implications. Non-Muslims, if they buy and sell pork, wine, etc., that with respect to them, they own what they buy and sell in those ways, and we do not object to them with respect to that amongst themselves. It also has implications that, let's say your next door neighbor owns a tattoo parlor. Are tattoo parlors permissible? Tattoos it's a major sin to get a tattoo, right? The Prophet ﷺ cursed, meaning that the one who gets a tattoo or seeks a tattoo, who gives someone a tattoo, or the one who gets tattooed, la'an means they are distancing themselves from divine mercy. It's a serious matter because it's tashweeh al-khilqa. It's dishonoring the لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. We have created the human in the best of forms. Anyways, so if your neighbor runs a tattoo parlor or has a wine shop and they're non-Muslim, can you start a business with them in some, can you start an ice cream parlor with them? 100% of their earnings are from selling wine or from a tattoo parlor? Yes, because their wealth with respect to them is considered to be validly acquired. And we don't hold them to the standards of the Sharia. But Muslims cannot do that. If a Muslim sells wine, that we say those earnings are haram, and you cannot transact with them on the basis of those earnings. And the rulings of transacting with those whose wealth is mixed are addressed at Seekers. This is not the time for that. Okay, so that's mubadat al-mal. The al here, therefore, is referential, is lil-ahd. Ay al-malul mutaqawwim. Right? As you know, the al is of different types. Lil-jins, lil-istighraq, can be categorical or encompassing, istighraq, or it can be lil-ahd. Here's al-malul ma'hud. Right? It is referential. It's referential, meaning you could translate, something of value, something valuable, meaning something of recognized value. Al-malul mutaqawwim. For something of recognized value. Why? Because the price does not need to be money. We're used to price being money, but now, there's a lot of discussion about the exchange economy, right? So I want to sell my, I don't actually, but I want to sell this microphone, and someone's trying to sell this book. So I say, I sell you this for this. That's a sale. That's a sale, right? And one of the tricky things when both the item of sale and the price are not money is which is the item of sale and what's the price. And they say, as a simplifying criteria, الثمن ما دخلت عليه الباء, that the price is what the ba enters upon. What, when you say for such and such. So the subject of the transaction is the item of sale. I sell you this. And the for such and such, or in exchange for such and such, that would be considered the price, because there are implications of that, as we touched upon in the introduction, we'll be coming to later. Okay. So that's an item of recognized value. We took the definition of al-mal, and what is mutaqawwim, that which is permitted to transact in the Sharia. So for a Muslim to buy wine would be invalid. It's invalid, it's batil. It's not of recognized value for them. For a Muslim to buy anything that is intrinsically haram would be an invalid sale. They don't own that. So they can't resell it as well, because you commit two sins by doing that. Let's say someone by mistake, in a moment of weakness, they purchased a big something of whatever kind of haram wine, of haram alcohol. So they did one invalid transaction. Do they legally own it? Or Islamically own it? They don't. The only thing you can do is to annul the sale with the person. But you acquired it through the haram, sinful transaction. Then you go and say, oh, I shouldn't have bought that. And you go and sell it on eBay or wherever you sell it. Second haram transaction, because you didn't own it to begin with and you were not allowed to sell it. So you commit two harams. Right? This is why being aware of these details is so important. Right? That also, of course, limits the spread of haram in society. Bit-taradi, through mutual agreement. This is not a necessary condition in a sale, because we will see that a sale into which you are coerced is valid yet suspended. Right? So let's say at Darul Munir, young brother Usman is on the phone with his bride. And the guy won't get off the phone. So this hot-headed uncle who really wanted a copy of the abridgment of the Ihya, because there's a class tonight. So he goes and he's fed up. The guy won't get off the phone. So he puts a gun to his head, says, "Sell me this book for $50. And he gives it to him under coercion. Is that sale valid? A sale under coercion, is it valid? Yes. Right? A sale under coercion is valid, but suspended. Why? Because let's say the retail price of the book was actually $43, right? So under coercion, Usman Bhai sold the book for $50. Once the coercion is lifted, he's like, great. Instead of $43, it got sold for $50. But let's say under coercion, he sold it for $20. When coercion is lifted, he has a right of annulling the contract. So strictly speaking, the taradi does not need to be mentioned. Because a sale without mutual agreement is still a sale. If there's an exchange, there's an offer and acceptance. Without mutual agreement, it is a sale. But without mutual agreement, it is valid, yet sinful from the court, from the party coercing, and it is suspended. It's called mawquf. But when the coercion is lifted, the party has the right, the coerced party has the right to complete the transaction or not. Because sometimes the coercion could lead to something you wanted, right? Okay. But the taradi, so some of the commentators criticize, why would Imam An-Nasafi mention taradi, mutual agreement, when it's a description of the complete sale, not the basically valid sale? The answer is, it is mentioned to show the proper sale in the Sharia, but also to highlight the critical role of taradi, of mutual agreement. Because a lot of the rulings of correct sales revolve around their established mutual agreement. And what corrupts a sale? The things that vitiate mutual agreement. Okay. And it is binding with offer and acceptance. Right? And with nonverbal exchange. So the offer, right? The offer, the ijab is awjaba yujibu ijaban. Right? Ijab, right, is the offer is those words or those actions that clearly affirm initiating the contract. So it can be spoken, it can be written, and it can be through an action. But that clearly affirm initiating the transaction. That's the offer. And then the acceptance, the qabul, are those words, or words spoken or written, or those actions, such as giving the item of sale or giving the payment, that clearly affirm the completion of the transaction. And it's also valid by ta'ati. Ta'ati is where both parties give the items of exchange without any formal offer or agreement. So our friend Usman is still on the phone hours later. So someone comes, he sees the price of the book, he picks up the book, puts $50 on the table, and the seller nods and doesn't say anything. So there's no formal offer, no formal agreement, but that's a mutual exchange with no indication of refusal. Right? With no indication of refusal. That's called ta'ati, nonverbal exchange. And nonverbal exchange is valid both, as the Tanweer mentions, fil khasis wal nafis, in items of low value and in precious items. Right? In items of low value and also in precious items. But in items that are precious, and what is considered khasis, cheap things, and nafis, expensive things or high value, this depends on custom. This depends on custom. But in general, it is in the Hanafi madhab, there are great imams within the Hanafi madhab, amongst them Imam al-Karhi, who said you cannot just do a non-verbal exchange, right, in precious items. That's not the madhab. Madhab is non-verbal exchange where indicative of mutual agreement is valid. You take the item of sale, you put the price, nobody objects, it's even enough. But in precious items, buying something of significant value, you should have a clear offer and acceptance. It's also recommended to put it in writing. Right? It's also recommended that if there are pending considerations or particular qualities agreed to, that you put the relevant details into writing. Right? So that's the non-verbal exchange, right? But then he tells us some details related to offer and acceptance, right? Now, the basis is that in a sale, each party is acquiring what belonged to the other. So it requires caution. Now, the basis would have been that the offer and acceptance would come immediately. And that's the position of some fuqaha outside our madhab, that there cannot be a gap between offer and acceptance. Why? Because people's mind changes. So someone gave an offer and they paused a little bit. The guy got offended. Why didn't you answer? And the person said, I accept. Right? But in our madhab, no. If an offer is made, it remains within the majlis when they're still together, engaged in the discussion. But this majlis is like a special dispensation, right? That I made the offer, you made to think about it a little bit. So we've extended, we've allowed the pause between offer and acceptance out of necessity. Why? They say لِلْحَاجَةِ لِلتَّرَوِّي, because people need to think. But in this precious extension, because the basis is offer and acceptance come together, right? Like, like other things. Can you, if you're praying, can you say, okay, I'll do my standing, and then auntie says, I'll go and take care of my son, and then I'll do ruku' later. No, the basis is that the integrals of an act all come together, right? You can't move on to anything. So when it comes to sales transaction, anything that could indicate the parting of ways negates the offer. So the offer stands as long as the majlis, right, which is when they don't move on to something. Either the majlis ends when they physically separate, or when they move on to something else. Right? So same uncle who came and took a book on gunpoint from Usman Bhai, then same guy comes 3 days later and said, Usman Bhai, I'm sorry, I'd like to buy 10 copies for $500. But Usman Bhai is a bit offended. So he says, you know what? Let me show you some tasbihs that I have, because he wants to sell him more expensive things instead. Because the books he's already has in mind who he wants to sell them to. So when they move on to something else, the offer goes. Right? So the majlis changes either by parting of ways, or if you move on to something else. But if you understand that the offer only stands within the majlis out of necessity, to consider, he says, وَأَيٌّ قَامَ عَنِ الْمَجْلِسِ قَبْلَ الْقَبُولِ بَطَلَ الْإِجَابِ. If either party, whoever stands from the majlis before the other party accepts, the offer is annulled. And they say, like the standing is وَكَذَا كُلُّ تَصَرُّفٍ يَحْتَمِلُ الْإِعْرَاضِ. Likewise, any other action that indicates turning away from the offer. From either party. Right? Why? Because let's say that uncle came to Dar al-Munir, and they say, dear brother, I would like 10 copies of this book for $500. So I want to buy 10 copies for $500. He makes an offer. So our dear Usman Bhai gets a phone call. So he points, hold on a second. He's on the phone call that, yes, we're going to have, let's order some karai chicken tonight, this and that. Talk to his other half. 5 minutes later, says, I accept. The guy is offended. Right? They feel, so that could lead to dispute. So if they're seated, to stand up, or likewise, to walk away and come back, would the initial offer is rescinded. Then if they were to say, I accept later, that second statement would be considered the offer. Right? So they say, so Usman Bhai comes back, say, I accept. That, so that would no longer be the acceptance that, because he walked away, talked on the phone, came back. So you can't assume that the offer still stands. A person could get offended. They could change their mind. Many things could have happened. So that after standing up, walking away, doing something else, says, I sell you these books for $500, say, I got to go to the washroom. Goes to the washroom, comes back. So I accept. The guy could have changed his mind. Traders move fast. He wanted to buy these books for $500, wanted to sell them. That $500, he made a few phone calls, purchased other things, sold them already. Okay? So when he says, I accept, after a gap, that is a new offer. It's like he's saying, I accept to sell you these books for $500. If uncle says, thank you, and takes them, that verbal act, that verbal statement or that act would be considered the qabul, the acceptance. Then he says, now the price needs to be known. Right? 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 So he says, لابد من معرفة قدر ووصف ثمن غير مشار لا المشار. That he says it is necessary to know the amount and description of the price, if not being pointed to. This applies to the price, and it also applies to the item of sale. Right? So the price has to be defined in what the price is and the amount. Right? So if we start with the price, right? So if you're set for, you meant specify, in our times, for example, you specify the currency and the amount, right? And that's what we'll see. And the assumption is from the currency of that land, right? If you're on a boat cruise and one person's from Canada, the other's from America, then you'd need to specify what kind of dollars. Is it Canadian dollars or American dollars, right? But if it's unspecified, but you're in the sea, right? So, and you're neither in Canadian waters or American waters, then you'd have to see which is more prevalent, and we'll come to that. So you have to define the category, the quality, which would be in our times like Canadian, American dollars, or where else, Australian dollars, etc. And so the amount and the quality description, like in the old times, sometimes they'd have multiple degrees of gold dinar and multiple degrees of silver dirhams. So this used to be a point leading to dispute. But you only need to specify the price if the price is not in front of you. Now, the price could be monetary price. It could also be non-monetary, right? Someone says, I'll buy your headphones, nice fancy headphones, for this box of organic premium jelly beans. We don't know how many jelly beans, but they are pointed to, right? Now, if they're pointed to, we don't need to specify. If the buyer wanted to know how many jelly beans am I getting, I should have asked. Because they're right there. Then unless you're cheated, that the bottom of the box of jelly beans was just newspapers, for example, instead of getting this much, a box this big and this deep, you only got it half full, then that would be, you are cheated. And we'll look at the fiqh of being cheated when we come to it. Likewise, if you're selling something, there are two scenarios. If it's in front of you, then if you say, for example, I sell you this for, like for example, let's say I want to sell my laptop, right? So I say I sell you this laptop for $2,000. And you agreed. It's right there. Unless I cheat you, it's not a laptop, it's a toy, right? Or there's hidden defects in it, right? If the price is present and pointed to, actually or effectively, it's right there, then, they say al-ishara أقوى أنواع التعريف. Pointing to something is the strongest ways of defining it. Then if you wanted to know more details, you should have found out more, unless there's cheating involved, right? If it's not pointed to, then you need to define what it is and describe it sufficiently to lift gross non-definition. And it depends on the item. So what is it? And the key qualities that would lift. So if it's, in our times, for example, if it's a brand, it's sufficient. Like if I'm selling my, this, what's it called? This USB microphone, if I mention the brand and the model, so I say I'm selling you a Blue Yeti X, right? And then, what else do you need to mention about if you're selling, a commercial product? It's new, it's used, etc. Then if the buyer wants to find out if it's an item that's commonly available, then you've defined it sufficiently. If the buyer wanted more details, they could read the reviews, whatever, right? But it's best to give sufficient details so that there's no uncertainty, right? But particularly in items that are customizable or come in different types, you're buying, you're selling a computer, for example, you give enough details that non-definition is lifted. So for example, what are main details people want to know if they're buying a laptop? Right? Let's say you're buying a MacBook Air. What would you want to know?
Why didn't you buy a MacBook Pro?
No, why did they buy a MacBook Pro? No, that's no. But let's say whatever, they're buying a MacBook, a particular model. But what would you want to know? What would you need to know?
How much RAM it is?
Yeah. So so there's things that are necessary to know, right? Amongst them is the issue: is it new or is it used, right? And typically, there's different value between new, open boxed, refurbished, used, for example. Right? Because imagine if you paid market price for a laptop, you discover it's a used laptop, right? This would lead to dispute. Would most of us be satisfied to pay market price for a used laptop? Of course not, right? But also, is this year's model the same as last year's model? No. So you need to specify you properly what year or what model it is, because that makes a difference, right? And then the other key details, right? And depends on the item. More expensive items, you need more details, right? But if you're buying a 50-cent generic pen, you just say, I'm selling, you sell them, a basic rollerball, whatever these pens are called, for 50 cents. You don't have to describe it like something you're selling for $5,000, right? In a way that lifts gross non-definition, which is the definition that would reasonably lead to dispute. But if you've pointed to it, then even if you described it wrong, right? So for example, if you're selling a donkey, right? And you say, I sell you this bull. You point to your donkey. I'll sell you this bull for $500. It's valid because you pointed to it, right? Of course, you shouldn't do that, but if it happens, right? Because pointing to something defines it without doubt, unless there's then cheating involved or something, right? And in this, right, we must define the price, and we must define, likewise, the item of sale, either by pointing to it. The sunnah would be, if you point to it, you tell the person, just inspect it, see it, right? you're satisfied. But nasiha is to give all relevant details above and beyond the minimum, or at least let it be there. Give them the opportunity to check. Right? And nasiha, caring for taking care of your good, but keeping in mind the good of the other is not just good business practice, it is sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Right? إِذَا نَصَحَا وَصَدَقَا. Right? Prophet ﷺ, the buyer and seller are in good as and are blessed in their transaction as long as they are true to one another and have sincere good concern for the good of one another. You don't wrong them and you want good for them. So you facilitate good for them, and that's the nature of the believer. Okay. But then the price, there are some considerations related to price, which we'll look at to finish today's class. He says, وَصَحَّ بِثَمَنٍ حَالٍ وَبِأَجَلٍ مَعْلُومٍ. A sale is valid with an upfront, with a price due upfront. And that is the asl, right? And that is the basis. Right? And you can sell, that's obvious. I sell you these headphones for $200. I would never do that. I sell these headphones for $200. You accept. The default is that it's hal. It is due upfront. Right? So if I sell it to you for $200, you say, give it to me. I say, well, pay me first, then I'll give it to you. That's very reasonable. It's due up front. Then I'll pay next week. Okay, I'll give it to you next week. Right? It's also valid وَبِأَجَلٍ مَعْلُومٍ. Right? Right? And if you've read Quduri and stuff, you'll notice how much more terse the expression here is in the Kanz. وَبِأَجَلٍ مَعْلُومٍ. Ajal is a deferral. Right? It says وَمُؤَجَّلًا بِشَرْطِ أَنْ يَكُونَ مَعْلُومًا, and deferred on condition that the deferral be known. Right? Right? On condition that the deferral be known. Right? So if you defer the price, right, what the scenario be? Uncle came in a fourth time. By now, Uncle and Usman Bhai have become friends. They sort of settled that I forgive you for the coercion for the sake of Allah, and they became friends. So Uncle comes and says, Beta, the translation of Ihya Ulumuddin, what is it called? Oh, Revival of the Religious Sciences, translated by Ustad Mukran Gizzu. Really good translation of the abridgment. Highly recommended, by the way. So it says, I'd like to buy 25 copies. I want all my extended family to revive their deen. Said, okay, ideal book for that. So they agree for this transaction to take place. Says, okay, but can I pay you later? Is a deferred transaction permissible? Is a deferred transaction permissible, folks? But what's the condition?
The price be fixed now.
It has to what?
Price to be fixed now.
Not just the price has to be fixed, but the deferral period has to be fixed. Right? And you can do that in two ways. You can either set a due date. Says, okay, Uncle, 25 copies, I'll give you a discount. 25 copies for $1,000. Right? 40 a piece rather than 50 a piece. Okay, they agreed on a price. Payable later, you either specify a due date. Payable on March the 1st. Payable in 60 days, 90 days, whatever they agree upon. Or payable in 3 years. It's all good as long as the due date is defined, either by date or by duration. Or it can also be defined due date. It can be what's called bitaqseet, right? In installments. But if it's known what the installments are, with $100 payable monthly, or whatever it is. If you don't define the period of deferment, the basis of the madhab is that if you don't define the period of deferral, then the transaction is, the basis of the madhab is, if you say, okay, uncle, I'll sell you 25 copies of this book for $1,000, payable later. The basis is that this is a corrupt transaction. Why? Because the buyer will want the money as soon as possible. Calls him on the weekend, Uncle G, can you give me the $1,000? He says, Beta, you said later, I understood by the end of the year. Need to dispute. That's, so with a defined due date. That's the asl of the method. But given that people consistently transact poorly, a lot of the late scholars said that there is a default in deferral, which is 1 month. So if an undefined deferral is mentioned, you can pay me later, it's understood to be by default 1 month. That avoids deeming a lot of transactions corrupt. Because people get earned typically on a month-to-month basis, etc. So you can consider that to be a sound validator for the transactions, right? So if the deferral has to be defined, if not defined, then the later scholars said it's deemed to be 1 month, and that's what was chosen. And you can find this in Hashid ibn Abdin and others, right? Right? And you can see this in those of you can access Hashid ibn Abdin in volume 4, page 22 of the Bulaq edition. Right? 23. Right? And this was chosen for fatwa by the later scholars. Right? In order to avoid, and this has been the position in the Hanafi school for centuries. Okay. ومطلقه على النقد الغالب وإن اختلفت النقود فسد إن لم يبين. When unspecified, the price is deemed from the prevalent currency in the land. If the currencies differ, the sale is corrupt unless it is clarified, right? So, and this would occur, of course, because often in the same land or in the same marketplace, there would be multiple gold currencies prevalent, right? So if unspecified, if you buy and sell in Canada, you'd assume it's dollars, Canadian dollars, right? You know, so in that, right? But if the currencies differ, boat crews, you have some Brits, some Americans, some Argentinians, and they enter into different sales transactions and they're all fighting each other because one says American dollars, the other says Canadian, other says this. Say, no, but we're on a Trinidadian boat. The British persons are saying, we rule you all. The Argentinian says, not us. Becomes one big show. So I said, no. So you consider, okay, is there a prevalent currency? If there isn't, then they can either agree on what currency it is, or the sale would deem to be corrupt and voidable. It'd be considered fasid, right? And then food, وَيُبَاعُ الطَّعَامِ كَيْلًا وَجُزَافًا. Food can be sold by measure, by weight or volume, and also juzafan, which is without weight or measure, right? So you have a sack of basmati rice, and auntie comes and says, Beta, this is amazing basmati rice. MashaAllah, it's so good. So Sister Naima says, I'll sell you this rice for 50 pounds. She says, great deal. Nobody weighed it. Nobody asked to weigh it. Maybe auntie has knows all about rice. She runs a biryani shop. So she knows how much it is. If she wanted to know how much it weighs, she would have asked. So you can sell food by measure, either weight, wazn, or kale, or volume, or number. I sell you these 24 bananas for whatever bananas sell for, right? Any ideas how much 24 bananas would be? $5? $10? I have no idea.
59 cents a pound, so
okay.
$4.99 if you're buying organic.
Okay. So let's say $5 for these 24 bananas. But you can also have a bunch of bananas and say, I'll sell you these bananas, Sister Sadia, for $7.99. Now she seems to know all about food and vegetable prices. But my wife did not allow me to enter the supermarket by our house for 3 years, right? Because our budget gets hit hard if I go shopping. So 3 years, right around the corner from the house, I had never entered. I was actually nervous entering the house. I had my wife, my kids, all of us went. It was like the entrance ceremony for me to go to the. And then I think now it's been 4.5, 5 years that we've been living here. I've only entered that supermarket, I think 3, maybe 4 times. Anyways, I don't know anything about food prices. But let's say there's a bunch of bananas. Someone who buys and sells bananas, they have a sense. This bunch, good price. You don't have to specify it if it's in front of the person, right? And this facilitates transactions because people who deal with something regularly, they can eyeball it, right? You go to you see a nice cut of steak, and you're like, how much is that? $20. Says, here you go. And they take it. Why? Because they work at the steakhouse, seems a reasonable price. They don't really care if it's 16 ounce or 17.5. They can eyeball that it's big enough for us. They can cut out a 12-ounce steak. The rest they'll use for fancy side dishes, right? So you can sell food by measure or weight or number or without measure, right? If it's present, right? This is if it is present. And also in a container or by the measure of or the weight of a stone whose extent is not known, right? So in a container, it says, right? I'll sell you this bowl of this rice. How big is the bowl? They didn't ask because they eyeballed it. They said, that looks big enough. Or a stone, you have to keep in mind, the old days, they used to, and it's many places still in the world, right? They would weigh things on a weighing scale, right? So the person has a stone. You don't know how much the stone weighs. So I'll sell you a stone's worth of this. If you wanted to know how much the stone was, you could check, find out, whatever. You didn't. The mutual agreement happened. Doesn't lead to dispute. If they cheated, if the stone is empty in the middle or something, that falls under cheating. So these transactions are, these are conditions related to price, etc. So these are some of the underlying conditions, underlying considerations related to price, the item of sale. And we'll continue from here, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, by looking at what if, some of the details related if you buy a bunch of something, right? If you buy, let's say, that sack of rice and say, I buy this rice, each kilo for $2. I don't know how much rice sells for. So auntie says, sure. Now, but we didn't agree. We didn't set how many kilos that rice is. Is that transaction valid or not? There's difference of opinion. The owner of Darul Munir sold so many books, he now wants to buy a flock of sheep. right? Because he wants to set up a website called mysheep.com. Something I had a dream about decades ago. So he decides to go and buy a flock of sheep. Goes to the farmer. He asks the farmer, how much are these sheep? So I'll sell you the whole flock of sheep. They're all, enclosed. Sell you the whole flock of sheep, each sheep for $200. That sounds good. I buy them. Now only the price per unit was described. Each sheep for $200. What's the problem? We didn't count how many sheep there are in the flock. Is that valid or not? Bought some cloth. Said, I'll sell you this cloth, this roll of cloth, each meter for $7.99, whatever the cloth would be. Is that valid or not? And related issues as well. And these also illustrate some principles. So we'll take those step by step, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Before we close, any questions?
A related question, and it's what's the best way to go about people who don't want to do offer and acceptance like in a taxi cab? They'll just say, "What type of man?"
Cry. No, so this used to be, so Imam Zayd said, so one of the things that used to cause Imam Zayd a lot of trauma in Damascus was the fact you get it, so you try to uphold good character everywhere, but you get into a taxi cab and they really test you. Because let's say they refuse to set the price. You have to set a price. Now, a meter is, assuming that it's untampered with, is a sound measure of price. You can see, and if it becomes too expensive, you can get off, right? So that's valid, right? Likewise, if there is a basis for the price, etc., so any of these taxi service companies, they have a basis per distance, time, etc. So it's objectively defined. That's actually surprisingly clear. But the problem is, you cannot initiate a sale or initiate the provision of a service, right? Whether hire, rental, employment, etc., without agreeing to the key terms. So what do? You can. Some say, well, let's see how long it takes. No, you have to, at the very least, put a cap. At the very least, put a cap. Right? You get someone to paint the house. How much are you going to charge? So, I don't know. It depends how long it takes. It's going to lead to dispute. So at least you set a cap. Said, okay. The best is to just agree. Do the whole house for this much. And we'll look at some of that with rental. But they say, okay, but no, you said, okay, you'll do the house for no more than this much, right? So if it's less than that, both parties have agreed to it, but you've put a cap, and that's one way. And you do your best, right? And where you're in a place where there's an option between undefined ways of working and defined ways of working, then you follow defined ways of working. And the fact that you say, well, this is the custom, we have a notion of sound custom, al-urf al-sahih. There's also unsound custom, which is al-urf al-fasid. And sadly, just as there are bad habits in non-Muslim countries, there are also bad habits that creep into some Muslim countries. The fact that Muslims do something wrong does not mean it's right. It's still wrong. right? Because not all custom is considered in the Sharia. Only sound custom that does not go against the general principle of the Sharia is considered. If you go to a country where everybody's a nudist, does it allow you to walk around naked? No, because it's an unsound custom. Similarly, if they transact in wrong ways, so but we transact with honor. Well, our honor is what Allah and His Messenger have given us. Without it, we're naked. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Inshallah, on Thursdays we introduced the 7:30 class at Seekers. We're starting the abridgment of Ihya Ulumuddin. We did an introduction to the class. You can find it on our YouTube channel, etc. You can register for the class through Seekers, and we're starting from the Book of Knowledge, from the beginning of the text. We'll be covering each of the books in 4 lessons. We're not going into it in detail, but we are covering it bi'idhnillahi ta'ala sufficiently so that you can benefit from this brilliant text. And there's a very good comment translation that you can benefit from, a revival of the religious sciences, translated by Muqran, Mokrane, Gizzu, Guezzou, or you can find it by Serenity Productions. I'm not quite sure what it's called, Productions, but it's available through Firdaus Books, both in the US and Canada. That's 7:30 Toronto time, right here from Seekers Guidance Canada. Wa barakallahu ta'ala fikum wa bikum walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.